Hi, my name's Lois, and I'm with the City of Somerville and Historic Somerville, Inc. I'm here to show you around the Milk Row Cemetery. So why is it called Milk Row? Jerry, do you know?
Yes, I do, as a matter. My name is Jerry Pierce, and I am Lois's colleague in this enterprise here. And it is called Milk Row because once a bridge was built between what was already then Somerville and Charlestown, there was a whole new flow of traffic routes. And primarily from the west and the north, milk and produce were brought into Boston via this route or via Washington Street.
Well, actually, it wasn't a bridge. It was a natural bridge. It was a.
Well, no. Apparently, some 70 years after that,
they built
there was a real bridge built.
But it was the neck.
It was the neck. It was Somerville. What became Somerville was very narrowly attached.
And this was called Charlestown Beyond the Neck.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't even know that Somerville was once part of Charlestown. Charlestown was huge. It went from where Charlestown is now all the way out to Woburn, west.
Right.
It encompassed many, many places. This was the country. From the 1600s to 1842, this was the country. And in 1842, Somerville became its own town because its interests started to separate from Charlestown. Charlestown was worrying about how many policemen they had on the street, and people here were saying, we don't have any streets. Why do we care about that? So there was a separation in 1842, and it became Somerville.
And it was a little bit an issue of, it was felt, taxation without representation.
Yeah.
That the locals at the time felt that they were paying taxes for what? And there was, for the first time then, a kind of a amalgamation of essentially farmers who were here and what was a growing middle class that in effect was creating Somerville as a sort of a proto-suburb. And if you go up to Broadway, behind many of the stores, you will see what remains of often quite grand houses that the merchants of Boston, who wanted a little peace and quiet because the city was so crowded, began to build houses.
So
Beautiful
going back
houses.
a little bit,
Yeah.
back in 1804, this became a cemetery. Earlier cemeteries were in Boston, Copp's Hill, what's the one across from the Parker House? I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, I'll remember it in a minute. Anyway, so Samuel Tufts gave his brother Peter Tufts and 4 other yeomen, he sold to them this land to be a private cemetery. Originally, it was those people and their friends, and then gradually other people who were not related to them began to be buried here. Hello, plane.
People were invited to be buried here, and for the price of $1,
You could buy a plot that was probably the size of the plot that's around the Civil War monument. 16 by 16 was the size of a family plot. And it had wrought iron gating around it at one time, but before this was taken over by the city in 1892, a lot of it was stolen. There was a market for wrought iron. And so back to 1804. Okay, I'm still consulting notes here. Sorry about that. So the first graves were these vaults over here. So we're going to walk. So down here is where Samuel Tufts and Peter Tufts are buried. Well, this is built into the hillside. It was recently repaired a year or two ago. Timothy. Why I kept saying Peter. That's wrong. Here's Samuel Tufts, here's Timothy Tufts. He sold the land so that his brother, who was ill, would have a place to be buried. And see, he dies in 1805. Samuel Tufts, even though it says 1805, he didn't die till 20 years after that. Maybe they put it in at the same time, I don't know, but he outlived his brother. You might notice that these flags are not your regular modern-day American flag, or even the 48 states American flag. It's a pre-Betsy Ross flag called the Grand Union. It has stripes and then a Union Jack. And have you ever gone to see the first flag on January 1st up on Prospect Hill?
No, I'm not.
It's really fun. It's really fun. Everybody marches from City Hall behind George Washington on his horse. It's only about 2 blocks, but and then there's a great ceremony and a reenactment of what supposedly happened, which was that everybody, the militia, were ready to just go home. They were freezing. They didn't have clothes. They didn't have ammunition. All their commissions were going to run out. And George Washington asked someone to design a flag to rally people. And supposedly this flag was raised for the first time on January 1st on Prospect Hill. And they also read aloud a letter from Charles III where that had finally gotten to the colonies. It was written in October or November. And that letter said, guess what? Let's just forget about this. You won't get anything you want. I won't hang anyone. I won't put anyone in jail. Let's forget about the whole thing.
It's kind of an amnesty was declared.
Right.
Yeah.
And people, they burned it in public and everyone relisted. And then, you know, this is before Lexington and Concord. So that's the story of the Grand Union. So back here,
This is
I'm getting a little out of chronological order, but there's a British flag back here because there are 2 British soldiers buried here, found 75 or 100 years after the Revolution on someone's land. And I don't know exactly how it was decided they were British. Perhaps their buttons or something left from their uniform, and then they were reburied here. And another promo for Historic Somerville. On Veterans Day, we have a wonderful ceremony here. And people from the Historic Guards come, and part of it is putting a wreath that comes from England every year on these graves, which I think is lovely. So let's walk a little bit back more, and we'll talk about I'm giving you an exercise program here. So what do people, does anybody have any questions about the tombs here?
What year, when this flag was for the first time presented at Prospect Hill, what year was it?
1795. 75.
Was it after when Washington took first time command of the Continental Army?
No, it's when he was taking command. It's as he was taking command.
Yeah, because there is this whole spot in Cambridge Common.
Yeah.
Where those
What does it
cannons,
say? Yeah.
I forgot the year. Let's say that's where George Washington took, for the first time, took command of Continental Army.
It was all the same time.
Okay.
I forgot to ask you guys. You live in Somerville, it sounds
Yes, I
like,
do. Yeah.
and you live someplace else. You live in Somerville, the other end. Okay. And Jerry lives
And
in
I live in
Somerville.
I actually have a home whose deed reads off the farm of Oliver Tufts. Well, the Tufts were an enormous family. There were the scuttle
getting
was
closer
when
to
they
you 'cause
had
I have the microphone.
when they would have a family get together. There would be 100 people, all of them fairly directly in the Tufts family. There were many of them, and one of the last ones who had a farm on Sycamore Street, where I live, was Oliver Tufts, who lived to be 83. So there's some actual photographs of him in historical sources. And he was called Farmer Tufts, and was apparently a very affable guy who was very good with children, who allowed children to come and pick fallen fruit because he had extensive orchards up in that part of the world. And so my deed actually reads off the land of Oliver Tufts. That's why
Pretty
I
cool.
take
But
some.
he's not buried here, is
He's
he?
not buried
He's
here.
not
I
buried
don't know
here.
where Oliver is buried.
Okay.
He died in 1883.
Huh.
And his land went from Broadway to Highland. It was the Tufts owned a lot of
Wow.
land, and to compensate for cutting, the railroad went through and cut his land in two, and to compensate, the railroad itself built a bridge. And that was Sycamore Street Bridge for a very long time. There's a new
I know.
one now.
I know that bridge. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have unrelated question, but
Go
you
ahead.
mentioned that Charlestown stretched all the way to Woburn.
I have a map back there on the thing. I'll show-
What led to that such pull? Because typically from what I've read and kind of looking at maps, there were settlements, kind of settlement that's pushing out, but that kind of seems.
It probably was, I don't know enough about the establishment of Charlestown. It probably was a land grant from the king, maybe?
So,
And then gradually parts broke off. I'm guessing, this is a guess here, folks. I will look into it. I always collect questions I have to look into more. But when we, but I'll go get it. Should we, okay, let me stay here. This is a map of Charlestown, but I have trouble, I think it's 1834. So here's what we call Charlestown. Here's the neck. This is the natural connection, skinny little connection. We're over here. See where it says schoolhouse? The cemetery. There was a schoolhouse on the corner. Like there's Prospect Hill, Winter Hill, Powder House. And look, it goes all the way to the Woburn line. But Medford existed. Medford and Malden were older. So it's like this skinny.
Skinny long.
Yeah, Cambridge was Cambridge. And gradually this stuff,
Started.
yeah. And Arlington's over there. Arlington,
Wow, that's
Brook.
neat.
I think if it says West Cambridge, I don't know if West Cambridge
must
became.
also have been bigger, yeah. So this
Yeah,
is
Cambridge
not
was
now
bigger.
Cambridge, yeah.
And then this other one, this was from before. This shows the neck more clearly. This is 1775. And so here's Charlestown as we know it. And we're up here where it says Charlestown Common. That's Somerville.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And all this has been filled in. And this is when Back Bay was a bay. Look, here's the common, and it's all water.
And it was all filled out.
Yeah.
it was all filled out.
It's pretty amazing. So some other things you see here are from the farm. We don't know how old the tree is. It's at least 100, not 200 years old.
And it is a genuine so-called American elm that
Still healthy.
managed to survive the great blight that pretty well. And it really is the case, I was reading somewhere, that elm trees were omnipresent in American towns, and almost every town, even where I grew up in Pennsylvania, has an elm street. And one reads that what is now Somerville Avenue was lined with beautiful elms all along it. And Elm Street is at the end where Somerville continues under Porter Square.
Another remaining detail that's from the early days of the cemetery, 1804, is the semicircular driveway. Because I am told that they would bring, the hearse was a horse-drawn hearse, and horses don't like to back up, so they would come here, unload the hearse, and then keep going and go out the other gate.
Out the other gate, because it
So-
was opened after the Second World War, when bodies would come home, and Somerville has no cemeteries. This is the only cemetery. Later on, there is a veterans cemetery at the end of Broadway towards the Alewife, but this was it, and so people used other cemeteries because this was the only one.
Cemetery, I mean, Somerville has a huge population, like what, 70,000 or something
Right,
now?
yeah.
And there's hardly any place to be buried. I mean, people get buried in Mount Auburn and Malden and just lots of other places, because you can only be buried here now if you can prove you're related to one of these people. The last
Yeah,
tomb, the last one is over there, 1979. And then I guess you have to be a veteran to be buried in the Veterans Cemetery. So if you're a regular person, I don't know where you're buried.
Mount Auburn was opened in 1842, so that would have been
Okay,
available
that's
to
today my
people.
eye.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But in any event, this was opened, and bodies were stored there until the Veterans Cemetery was opened. Was
A couple of
started
years after the war.
A couple years after. It's now, Barbara, one of the historians, one of the city historians, it is now soldered shut. But in terms of the general redevelopment of the cemetery, these will be opened and examined to see, one, if they're structurally sound, because they're ovals, and the earth is sitting on top of them, and so they want to see just what kind of shape they're in. And from what we know from that one there, it was described as being rather like bunk beds in there. There are shelves where bodies could be laid.
So moving on a little bit in the history of Somerville, if you look behind you, these industrial buildings are part of 7 existing buildings out of an original 20 that were part of the American Brass Tube Works. And brass tubing, I think they go back to about 1830, and this is part of the second set of buildings. They were such a success and so popular that they knocked down the first set of buildings and built a second. These are from like 1880, and brass tubes, seamless brass tubes, were important in locomotives, railroads, but also stationary engines, and eventually plumbing, early plumbing. I think it was in existence till 1930, 1940, something like that. And now they're privately owned, and like there's artist studios up in this one, I know that. There's 7 left in this area. They're all, I think, on this side of Somerville Avenue. They go that way. They've been turned into other things. But other industries that were here in the Union Square area were where Conroy Park is. It was the bleachery, the Middlesex Bleachery and Dye Works. That whole big area of that park.
They manufactured textiles, apparently very beautiful textiles, printed, and apparently they also did cleaning. I mean, they cleaned clothes at the bleachery. So I.
Or did they just? Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I will learn more too. And anytime you want to chime in, just chime in if you've been. You know, we're newbies here. There were also slaughterhouses, more over toward Washington Street.
Yeah, down where Target is. Down there. And interestingly enough, my house, which is 58 Sycamore, abuts the railroad directly. The deed to my house reads off the land of Oliver Tufts and the Boston and Lowell Railroad of, 1835. And there was maybe a quarter of a mile further up the railroad. It's called a gravity push. There were 4 tracks, and when mostly hogs, some beef, would come into the stockyards, which were down here, the so-called Boynton stockyards, they would be in railroad cars that would be detached from the engine and pushed. And there was a so-called gravity feed that would bring them down to the actual stockyards, which were very extensive.
And there must have been wharfs, even though it's hard to imagine now, in Union Square. I mean, part of this was filled in. There used to be something called the Miller River, but from the slaughterhouses and other industrial waste, it became really smelly and stinky, and it was always boggy, and they filled it in the 1870s. I have yet to find a map that shows exactly where, but it's someplace in there, and not there anymore. There are brickyards. There was glass making. The Union Glass Company, which morphed into, went out of business, went back into business, and became Corning Glass in New York eventually.
Started in Union Square.
Yeah, started in Union Square, because they were, which at one time was called Sandpit Square, among other things. Do you know why it's called Union Square?
No.
I bet you could figure it out. The Union Army had a recruitment center there.
Oh, okay.
And that's the one that stuck. Had a couple other names too. And these
are slate.
Slate.
Yeah.
Yeah, the darker ones are slate, and all the ones like in Copp's Hill, they're all slate. That was the material of choice in the 1600s, 1700s.
And seems to be the most durable. It was very hard to work with, but it has stayed time, as opposed to the marble ones that, particularly in the Victorian period, people loved to use marble because it was much more flexible in terms of design and such like that. But on the other hand, the weather has weathered it, so to speak, and a lot of the inscriptions are no longer readable.
Every year, the city chooses to use some of the money to clean up some of the graves. The ones like that little red flag there, that's going to be cleaned, and you can see materials lying out on the grass. So we have oldest ones out of slate, and then we have marble and limestone, and marble and limestone don't last very well. Where's my list here? Granite? There's only one
There's
granite.
only one granite, yes.
Oh, that there, and there's one here, I think.
That's right.
Yeah. Most modern headstones are made of granite.
And there is a whole field of scholarship devoted to the iconography of tombstones. And in the earlier tombs, for instance, in city of Boston, like in Copp's Hill and such, sort of at the height of original Calvinism, the inscriptions, not the inscriptions, but the design would often be skulls.
That was pretty creepy.
I mean, and then as the 19th century moved along, and when New England Calvinism softened itself a bit, you had much more where tombstones were meant to sort of console people,
Right.
rather than frighten the
Scare.
life out of them. And so you had weeping willows, urns, things like that.
Sometimes we don't have any here, but there were drooping roses.
And there is a rose over there.
There's a rose
yeah.
over there.
Okay. Yeah.
So I know a little story about Anna, who was alive during the Revolution, and she, on the night of April 18th, 1775, when the regulars were marching from, they had come across to go out to Lexington and Concord and retrieve, capture, take back gunpowder. They were marching here, down Milk Row,
She spotted them.
and she saw
She
them.
heard them.
And she went to warn her neighbor, Samuel Tufts, who was making gunpowder or bullets or whatever they used in his barn. And she said, the regulars are out. You know, what should we do? And
Redcoats are coming.
right, well, anyway, ha ha, right? Anyway, so that's Anna. She was out because she had slaughtered a pig and didn't want it stolen, because people used to raid people's larders. Here we are. This is the Civil War monument. No one is buried here. It took me a while to realize that. It is land donated by Enoch Robinson, who was a well-to-do, am I saying his name right?
Hardware
Yes.
stuff that, according to people who know about
Fancy
these-
hardware.
fancy hardware that is much sought after.
And he also built a house called the Round House.
House on Atherton Street off Somerville Avenue.
Yeah.
That is a round house.
Anyway, so if you look at this first, this is really the front. It says SLI, Somerville Light Infantry, Incorporated, 1853, because between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, there was no standing army. So towns just decided whether to have or not have a militia. So at some point, Somerville decided it needed a militia again. And can we read this?
Erected by the Somerville Light Infantry with the balance of the fund generously contributed by their fellow citizens in
Aid, I think.
in aid of the company on entering the U.S. service for 3 months, April 19th, 1861, in memory of all from this town who have fallen in the service of their country. I'm trying to remember the statistic I read this morning, but that over the 5 years of the Civil War, something like 1,065
People
men
served.
58 were killed, and 250 were seriously wounded.
And there were only 8,000 or 9,000 people in Somerville
I
then,
mean,
so that's a
yeah,
lot of
that's
people.
Sure.
So the call went out for people to enlist in 1861, and people thought it would be over quickly. They thought it would be a skirmish in the south. So people went south, and then if you start to go around the monument,
And on April 19th was when Lincoln then put forth a call
right,
to the various militias, because as Lois said, there was no standing army, so to speak.
by this side of the monument, people were entering service for 3 months. Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And their names, these are names of people who died. And then if you keep coming around, as the war went on and didn't end, people enlisted for 9 months. And if you go to the other side, it becomes 3 years.
Oh.
So it just, the
And you
war.
see what then began to happen as the war continued, far beyond what people anticipated. They ran out of space. So they had to start inscribing on the obelisk itself. That was not intended originally.
This is, we're never quite sure exactly what it's the first of, but it's certainly it's the first. It was erected during the war, so it's one of the first, if not one of the first, monuments to people who fell in the Civil War that still exists in exactly the same place that it was built. So it's a pretty important monument. It's very sad over here. I mean, by the end of the latter part of the war, people were dying in prison. See, it'll say mass prison. See, if you read up from the bottom. Wilderness was the name of a battle. That doesn't mean in the wilderness. But people died in prison, and they found out that they died.